The Elder Scrolls Shadowkey. You may have heard of this one, as it's become sort of infamous over the last few years for being that Elder Scrolls game you play on a Nokia, or however you want to pronounce it. Shadowkey is essentially the story of the main character finding themselves going against the machinations of Yegor Tharn, the main antagonist of the first Elder Scrolls game, and attempting to defeat a powerful entity he was attempting to conjure up called an Umbra Keth. But that's not what's important. During these events, you run into a character called Azra Nightwielder. If this name is familiar to you, that may be because everyone's favourite Telvanni, Neloth, talks about him during the Dragonborn DLC and asks you for help with locating his staffs. However, Azra wasn't just a staff crafter, he was the first Shadow Mage, and essentially developed Shadow Magic himself. The more standard aspects of Shadow Magic aren't anything too crazy, in fact, they're not even particularly unique. Fortifying the mind and summoning different items such as weapons and armor, pretty standard stuff, and not even particularly uncommon. But the title of this video isn't what it is for no reason. So let's get into the interesting stuff. Firstly, let's talk about the titular Shadow Keys. Whilst Shadow Magic can construct Shadow Gates, the Shadow Keys are the only way to open them. So naturally, they're a convenient collectible for a video game. But the Shadow Keys are capable of other feats too, even resurrection. But impenetrable barriers and resurrection are just scratching the surface. Azra realized that shadows were not simply the absence of light, but reflections of other worlds, and these reflections were created by conflict. Something as small as light hitting an object is one such conflict, but something like an actual war creates a far more powerful reflection. In fact, this power was the basis of the creation of the Umbra Keth mentioned earlier. Now, where this gets really interesting and incredibly powerful is when someone like Azra starts to capitalize on this potential. Azra began refining the art. Shadow magic became capable of things like short-range teleportation and telepathy. But let's go back for a second. Remember how I said shadows are reflections of other worlds? That is quite literal. Shadow magic allows one to enter other worlds and bring those from other worlds over to their own. That's right, the Elder Scrolls was doing multiverses way before Marvel made everyone bored of them. But Azra wanted to take this a step further. He wanted to merge every version of himself into one, giving himself untold power. Unfortunately for him, he was foiled by a detachment of Redguard mercenaries and lost control of his magic and almost died. But luckily, this accident left him in the perfect place to help the protagonist of Shadowkey. So hey, all's well that ends well. But unfortunately, despite many of the uses of shadow magic surviving beyond this point, no one has really unlocked the true potential of shadow magic. Perhaps no one has the deep understanding of it that Azra did, or perhaps it's simply too dangerous. It is a force that has proven deadly to its wielders in the past. But this does leave us with one little hanging thread. Nocturnal. She is, after all, known as the Mistress of Shadows, and does have connections to artifacts such as the 11 Shadow Keys, the Shade Sickle, and the Bow of Shadows. Even the Skeleton Key may have connections to shadow magic, with its potentially infinite possibilities and power. But Nocturnal has never really made use of this multiverse-bending, reality-warping, mind-altering power either. Well, except once summoning the shadow version of Sotha Sil to take over the Clockwork City, but in theory, she could do so much more. But then, if the Skeleton Key has infinite possibilities and power, then she could use that too. Perhaps it's a good thing that the master of such volatile and dangerous forces doesn't care to use them. She's always been rather enigmatic, after all. Even the shadow magic her forces wield is far weaker than it could be, especially the shadow barriers. These can simply be turned off with light. a far cry from the power of the Shadow Gates. But then again, maybe this is all just ESO being ESO. But if I keep going further on this, I'll just keep talking about Nocturnal, and that is a subject for its own video. But I find shadow magic such a cool concept that's unfortunately just been sort of relegated to magic that is shadowy, rather than this reality warping power we saw back in Shadowkey. I would love for it to return properly. Perhaps someone in the Elder Scrolls 6 will have found Azra's work and attempt to refine it even further or something. Shadow magic could have such huge implications for the world, especially during times of great conflict, which there have been a lot of. But regardless, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time.